Hey guys, it's Dr. Weebrecht here. Wanting to take a minute and go over with you chapter 3 a little bit here in reference to socialization. I attached this to our Brightspace link, so you will have the whole slideshow as well as a couple videos, one of which includes the discussion we had about Oksana and feral children as well. So I wanted to take a moment so you guys had a few opportunities to take a look at our upcoming lesson plans. We had previously talked about feral and institutionalized and isolated children. We're going to continue that discussion. I included an article in reference to Anna that I want you guys to read, and then I want you to go on the discussion board and post and respond to a classmate. Okay, and make sure that you watch the video in reference to Oksana. That 60-minute documentary was really important because I think prior to that, we tend to think of it as something that was fan fiction, something that we had heard about, but it was, more like that concept of Tarzan, something where we didn't really think that it actually existed. And so all of a sudden now we do have something there that is very much based in real life. These are outlier cases, but these are things that I think are important when we discuss about socialization. Okay. We had furthered our discussion yesterday in reference to Cooley. Charles H. Cooley sort of coined that term, the looking glass self, which I think is really interesting. Here, if you recall, this is that three-step process. And so here are those 3 steps again, where we imagine how we look to others, where we interpret others' reactions and how they evaluate us, and then, of course, that third one where we develop a self-concept. So remember that through that self-concept, it begins early on in our childhood. That development, though, is continually ongoing. It is a lifelong process. So we will constantly be evaluating ourselves through that looking glass, according to Cooley. And these can be a favorable reflection in that social mirror where we have that positive self-concept, or that negative reflection can also lead to a negative self-concept in that same term. So even if we misjudge others' reactions, those misjudgments become part of our self-concept overall. So it's really important that we look at that. And remember, this development is an ongoing, lifelong process. We are going to constantly be doing this. At one point in our life, we might have really struggled with that negative self-concept. But as we become older, maybe we've had different experiences, and maybe we've learned on how to interpret that social mirror a little bit better. And so all of a sudden, we might have more of a positive self-concept. I want you guys to take a look at this video. I'll let you guys click on that link yourself in that slideshow. This is a good example of how that looking glass self really is interpreted. It provides you guys a strong foundation as to what Cooley was meaning when we start to realize that we are not born with that intrinsic knowledge of ourselves or others. We develop these skills through that social interactions, through that contact and observations that we have. It goes back to that nature versus nurture argument, right? What's hereditary and what's nurture? What's part of our social environment? How does that social component of it really impact how we are as people and how we interact with others? We had then discussed about George H. Mead, and we talked about the concept of play, which is critical to that development of ourself, right? So Mead basically said that not only the self, but also that mind is that social product, okay? And so all of a sudden now, we understand that the development goes through different stages. And so we learn that through the concept of play, he says, which is really important. And we take on the role of others, right? Remember when we dressed up like a teacher, or we decided we were going to be that NASCAR driver, or whatever, right? We use those examples that we had in class, whether it's you were going to be a repair person, right? Or maybe a nurse or a doctor, or whatever the case is. We put ourselves in someone else's shoes, and we understand how it feels and thinks. We anticipate what they're going to do in those reactions, And as a result of that, we develop that ability through the significant other. So that significant other is somebody who significantly influences someone else. Remember how in kindergarten, that kindergarten teacher was really important to us. That's why everyone wanted to be a teacher right away, right? Because that was extremely poignant to us, because we were given new cues as to how other people react and behave. So we learned through 3 concepts, we said. The first one is imitation. So here we're talking about children under the age of 3, where there's no sense of self, where we begin to imitate other people, right? I'm going to be a teacher. I'm going to set up all my stuffed animals, that kind of thing, right? 2 is play. This is from ages 3 to about 6, where we play pretend, princesses, Spider-Man, we're a firefighter, whatever the case is. Stage 3 now is where we start to look at games, and we had talked about that. That's what we tend to think of, because now all of a sudden from ages 6 or 7 or on, right, you guys are in team sports, that organized play. You're in football, you're in softball or baseball or soccer, whatever it is. Those team games are really important because we learn how to anticipate what other people are going to do or say. It's funny how we get older, how these begin to change and evolve. Okay, Mead also distinguished that there's a difference, right, between the I and the me in the development of ourself. Okay, so here I want you guys to look at this particular link. Take a minute, watch it, because Mead concluded that not only the self, but also the mind is that social product. And so we want you to understand that I and that me differ in how we interpret things. So I want you guys to take a look at it. We're going to discuss this more in class on Friday, and that way you guys have a better understanding of it. So remember that I is the self, okay? That's the subject, the active, spontaneous, sort of creative part of yourself. I shoved him, right? You're taking accountability in that sense. The me, on the other hand, is that self as an object. So here we're taking up those attitudes we internalize from others, right? And those interactions from other people. Well, he shoved me, that kind of thing, right? So both of those are very much products. And so Mead believed we cannot think without the use of these symbols. So that I and that me are really important when we begin to look at the development of who we are, and how we begin to internalize and how we begin to interact with other individuals. Okay. Jean Piaget, I don't know if you guys have heard of him. If you took psych class, you would understand that he is one of the core developmental individuals, especially when it comes to cognitive skills. So we're going to talk about 4 particular stages, okay? And I'm just giving you the brief overview today because we're going to eventually dive into this a little bit more, okay? There are 4 stages. The first one is the sensory motor stage. Here we're looking about birth to about 2 years of age, and we're looking at how I understand at that age of it, right, our understanding is very limited to that direct contact. If I cry, they're going to pick me up. If I'm hungry or I whine, they're going to feed me, that kind of thing. Or if I cry, maybe I'm going to get my diaper changed, right? All those little things. So very limited within that contact. The second stage is pre-operational. Here we're ages 2 to 7. Here we're developing that ability to use different symbols, okay? So this is called our pre-operational stage. Think about that. We now know, in this sense, that if I put my arms out, and I give you a look, maybe that means I want a hug, right? So we're developing different kinds of cues and symbols in order to interpret what we want and how we begin to reason and how we begin to develop. Right? If I put my hands and I'm opening and closing my hand, right? Maybe that means give me, right? Or I want that kind of thing. We develop different things. We begin to learn our languages, right? How to write our name and how that symbolizes us in that sense. There's so many different parts of it. The third one is the concrete operational stage. Here we're looking about ages 7 to 12. And we begin to reason our abilities, which are more developed. They begin to sort of take on themselves, right? So that's why they don't necessarily start, it's hard for kids at times to reason and to understand certain kind of concepts, why people would do certain things, right? It's always sort of black and white. Well, I thought this, if I did this, then this would happen. They don't realize that gray area can exist because their reasoning ability has not developed in that sense. Now, it has eventually begun to grow in this particular stage, but understand that that concrete operational is really important for us to look at, because remember what you were like at that age, right? What were you doing? It's definitely characterized by the concept of that logical thought, right? If all of a sudden you start sneezing like crazy, right, and a cat comes in, you might at that stage begin to be like, oh, well, maybe I'm allergic to cats, right? Or you might think, okay, there's concrete situations. There's time, there's space, there's quantity. All of those are going to be applied in that stage where we begin to really distinguish between our own thoughts and the thoughts of others, right? So we begin to classify things more. We begin to think logically about objects and events. And we begin to perform different kinds of things in a little bit more complex kind of stage. The fourth one and final one is something called the formal operational, okay? That formal operational stage usually happens between ages 12 and on. Here we're looking at a much more abstract, much more different kind of concept of thinking overall. Think about it. Here we learn more theoretical kind of things. We're planning things. We're strategizing things, right? All of a sudden now, we begin to reason a little bit differently in that sense, right? All of a sudden, we realize there might be possibilities. We begin to think ahead of things, right? Well, if I do this, maybe I can eventually do this, right? So we begin to problem solve, and we have very methodical, logical kind of approaches to life, right? That's why we're able to handle a different kind of level of math. As you guys get older, they start throwing at you like algebra and geometry and, physics and all that stuff. Because prior to that stage, you might not have been ready for that kind of abstract thinking that occurred, right? We typically tend to do this as we continue into adulthood, right? We logically use different symbols, right? And then we're beginning to look at different numerous variables that can happen as a result of it. There's possibilities, there's cause and effects that begin to happen. So here's another clip I want you guys to take a look at. It breaks it down at the different stages. It gives you guys a different overview in case my explanation isn't, it's sort of hard to follow. This provides a different way for us to look at it. Okay. The final thing that I want to say before we jump into Freud, because this is going to start a new section for us, is that Cooley and Mead and Piaget really became to regard themselves in the self and reasoning and believe that it became universal. There's not a consensus about the universality of Piaget's 4 stages of cognitive development, right? The idea is, with Piaget's thoughts, maybe some adults never actually reach that 4th stage, that abstract thinking. Have you ever met somebody who were like, boy, that is really hard for them? They tend to think more logically. It's black or white kind of concept. That gray area, that abstract, that part of it might not have developed. So the content from what we learn, when you think about it, varies much by our environment, our culture, the things, those experiences that we've had. So that's really important for us to look at as we begin to move forward here. We're going to wait to jump into Sigmund and Freud until Friday. We are going to be able to talk about, if you took psych class, you'll understand that Sigmund Freud really has some very interesting kind of thought processes. So we're going to look at the development of our personalities a little bit more. We're going to talk about Kohlberg and some other kind of studies, as well as we're going to jump into our socialization into gender, okay?